And now it's time for Talking Trade with Ian Coxhead and Sandi Siegel, sponsored by Michael Best Strategies and MMAC's World Trade Association.
Hi, and welcome back to Talking Trade. I'm Ian Coxhead at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
And I'm Sandi Siegel, president of ME Day, and it's our pleasure to welcome back previous speaker, Ngosong Fonkem. Ngosong is a trade compliance attorney at Page Fura and a lot of experience with diverse business sectors. And in particular, you've worked on international trade-related issues, which we're, of course, interested in talking about, and various import controls and sanctions. So we're all, of course, paying attention to what's going on in Russia and further invasion of Ukraine. And consequently, both the BIS and Customs and President Biden have taken both import and export measures to raise the duties and control the goods going to and coming in from Russia. So all of this matrix of sanctions and export controls can really, be challenging and pose some business and legal challenges for the companies here and elsewhere, and certainly anybody that has a footprint doing business with Russia. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit. What's unique in about the economic sanctions and how we've approached Russia, and how is this different than how we've reacted and imposed sanctions with other governments?
Good morning again, Ian and Sandi. Once again, thank you very much for inviting me to the show. Before I get started, again, I'd like to make your typical disclaimer that the views expressed by me today are my own, and they do not necessarily represent those of my employer or my clients. Now, to answer your question, as you know well, the resulting impact of these sanctions have caused many Western companies, many of whom are Wisconsin companies, to halt their operations or pull out of the Russian Federation. Whether this has been due to the complexities navigating a dynamic sanctions environment, or whether this has been due to ambiguity around beneficial ownership of high-risk partners, or whether this has been due to reputational concerns, a calculation that is the right thing to do, or a combination of any one of these factors. But I think regardless of any one of these reasons, you and we all can conclusively agree that these sanctions are causing a seismic trade shift, which is significantly disrupting global trade flows. Now, to put things in perspective, this is the first time since the end of the Cold War that sanctions of this magnitude has been levied on a major economy of the world. Russia is essentially has become the most sanctioned country in the world, essentially bypassing Iran. Now, bear in mind that the country is the 11th largest economy in the world in GDP terms, the 5th largest economy in the world in PPP terms. And you pick any commodity out there, Russia is among the top 3 exporters of that commodity. And then it's also an important country in the sense that it's also a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Now, if you juxtapose these facts to, let's say, Cuba or Iran, for example, which would be countries that have faced severe US and Western sanctions in the past and ongoing, we would even say, Cuba is a small island country whose economy is primarily derived from tourism and the production of sugar. And Iran, although having the 19th largest economy in the world, has been under some form of Western sanctions, US and Western sanctions, for just under 50 years. So its economy was never really connected to the US economy or the Western economy for that matter.
Right.
So the sanctions on Russia, a major economy, is quite significant, not only for the US economy, but also that of the world.
Interesting. So, the duty rates, and of course, Russia is now, higher duty rates under column 2 duties, and, no longer, doesn't get any of the favored nation status and duty rates. And if some goods are prohibited, what other kind of, industries are affected besides grain and energy, which we're all talking about, of course, because of, food shortage concerns and fuel costs. What other industries are really impacted by some of these sanctions and prohibitions?
I think to adequately answer that question, and before I get to that question, I think it's important just to sort of provide an overview of the sanctions regimes to sort of help your audience understand the context. Economic sanctions are really political, and I would like to emphasize political tools of trade used by governments to alter the strategic decisions of states and non-state actors that threaten their interests or violate international norms. And in the United States, these are typically issued by the President of the United States in consultations with the Department of Commerce, the State Department of State, and among some other federal agencies. And sometimes they are issued by acts of legislation by Congress and enforced by a number of federal agencies such as the Bureau of Industry and Security, Office of Foreign Asset Control, and a few other federal agencies. Now, as to these forms of sanctions, on the one end of the spectrum, typically you have embargoes, which is basically an official ban on trade or commercial activities with a particular country. And then on the other end of the spectrum are tariffs, which essentially are a tax placed on imported goods from a particular country. And then in the middle aisle are sanctions, and these sanctions can either be primary sanctions or secondary sanctions. Within the primary sanction bucket, you can have sectoral sanctions or geographical sanctions. Sectoral sanctions prohibit U.S. persons from engaging with entities or persons within a specific sector of a sanctioned country. For example, the financial sector, right, energy, et cetera, et cetera. Geographical sanctions similarly prohibit U.S. persons from engaging in virtually all commercial activities with an identified geography of a sanctioned country, or sometimes even the entire country. So you can think of an embargo as an extreme form of geographical sanctions. So with regards to, well, I guess secondary sanctions, I forgot to mention, then would prohibit third persons from engaging, from doing business with a sanctioned entity, otherwise the risk being cut out of the US market. Now, so with regards to the Russian sanctions, we've seen sanctions come in all the various forms that I have just spoken about, except one, which would be secondary sanctions. So now we've seen sanctions imposed on various Russian businesses and individuals. And sanctions on individuals disrupt trade in the sense that US persons are prohibited from engaging in business that's owned 50% or more by a sanctioned entity or person. We've also seen sectoral sanctions imposed on the Russian financial sector, energy, and among others, a number of other sectors. We've seen restrictions on the sale of certain commodities to the Russian Federation. For example, I have a client that prior to the sanctions, they used to import about $5 million worth of used vehicles to the Russian Federation and Republic of Belarus. Now, as a result of the restrictions on the export of used goods, luxury goods to Russia, that business is essentially dead. And now, I don't know how you can consider a used Hyundai to be a luxury good, but I guess I'm not really.
Depends on the country, I guess.
Yeah, I suppose.
Depends on the buyer.
Yeah, right.
Exactly, it depends on the buyer. Exactly. And as Sandi, as you mentioned, there's also been suspension of normal trade relationship with Russia at the WTO level, which means that imports of Russian goods will not be subject to column 2 tariff duty tariff rate on the HTS code. And just about a month ago, certain imports of Russia were also imposed, I guess, a 35% duty rate. And there's also been a complete ban on trade with persons and entities in the separatist region of Ukraine, which would be Lugansk, Donetsk Republic. And prior to that, in 2014, that same complete ban applied to the Crimean region. Now, I think it's also important to note that even if your trade is not restricted, you still have to consider whether you're able to get your goods to Russia, right? Because no U.S. shipping company is currently servicing the Russian market. And conversely, Russian ships are not allowed to call at U.S. or Western ports. And assuming that you can get your goods to the Russian Federation, you still would need to consider whether you're able to get paid or not, because most Russian banks, especially the big ones, have been cut out of the SWIFT network of banks. So as a business person engaged in international trade, I think these are just a few of the challenges that you now have to consider in this new reality.
Wow, Ngosong, that's a very complex task for any company, and obviously a lot of Wisconsin companies, both importers and exporters, must be thinking about ways in which they can minimize the impact of these sanctions. We're out of time for today, but I imagine that we could come back in the very near future and talk more about some of those examples, and that would be a really great way to follow up on this conversation. So Ngosong Fonkem, thank you very much for joining us on Talking Trade today, and we look forward to seeing you again in the very near future.
Thank you very much, Ian and Sandy.
Thank you for joining us again.
And I look forward to coming back and talking about those strategies to manage global trade risk. Thank you again.
Yeah.
You've been listening to Talking Trade with Ian Coxhead and Sandy Siegel, sponsored by Michael Best Strategies and MMAC's World Trade Association.